I've entitled my talk, IANDS from Research to Relevance, in order to align it with the theme of the entire conference, which is past reflections, present enlightenment, and future illumination. I've got to admit that I feel calling our present situation enlightenment is a bit optimistic, bordering on arrogance, but that's the way it is. I'm not going to be presenting to you any new research data today. Instead, I'm going to present my personal perspective on where IANDS has come in the last 40 years and where we want it to be in the next 40, from research to relevance. Now, this is just my personal viewpoint, and tonight you will hear different views from the other founders of IANDS and from the other pioneers who played major roles in the beginning of IANDS. IANDS, as you all know, stands for the International Association for Near-Death Studies. However, I'm going to suggest that IANDS may have outgrown that name. It may be time to reimagine the organization to reflect the changes in its focus over the years. The story of IANDS began for me in 1975 with the publication of Life After Life, which was the first book to use the term near-death experience and the acronym NDE in the English language. This little book was published by an unassuming medical student named Raymond Moody. Raymond had been a professor of philosophy and had studied ancient Greek literature in which there were many accounts of what we now call NDEs, including the account of air from Plato's Republic. And then when Raymond met George Ritchie, a psychiatrist in Charlottesville, Virginia, who described his own near-death experience, Raymond was struck by the similarity to the ancient Greek accounts he had already known about. When he then entered medical school, he started asking his patients if they had remembered anything from the time they were dead or near death. In the course of his medical school career, he collected about 150 such cases and summarized them in Life After Life, along with some commentary about how they were like the ancient Greek sources. Life After Life quickly became a bestseller, and Raymond was receiving letters and phone calls from scholars and clinicians all over the country who wanted to study this new phenomenon. By then, Raymond had started his psychiatric training at the University of Virginia and really didn't have time to deal with this. So he asked his friend, medical sociologist John Odette, to organize a meeting of about 20 of these people. These were, generally speaking, isolated scholars who were working alone in their individual institutions without much support. So that group decided that we needed to form a group to provide support to each other and to set standards for what near-death research should be like. Some of the earliest meetings of this group met at Raymond's farmhouse in Headwaters, Virginia. To give you a better idea of how remote this farmhouse was, this arrow points to the farmhouse. This is obviously not a metropolitan area. In fact, in the most recent census, Headwaters had a population of 111. Raymond himself, although he convened this group, was not interested in forming an organization. But 4 of us did so. That's psychologist Ken Ring on the left, and then John Odette, myself, and cardiologist Mike Sabon. As you can see, it's such a cash-strapped organization that we couldn't even afford haircuts. When we tried to think up a name for this group, someone suggested it should be called the Association for the Scientific Study of Experiences Near Death, because we thought that the initials spelled out ascend, which is what we had in mind. But then we realized it didn't really spell out ascend. So John Odette, who was functioning as president of the group, suggested we change the name to the Association for the Scientific Study of Near-Death Phenomena, whose initials mercifully could not be pronounced. A few years later, the organization moved into Ken Ring's 10 by 14-foot windowless office at the University of Connecticut and was incorporated as the International Association for Near-Death Studies, whose initials reassuringly spelled nothing, but at least could be pronounced. The original goals for this organization were to foster near-death research. That is, three of us thought it was. Ken Ring, Mike Sabom, and I were basically empirical scientists who were trying to promote research into NDEs. John Audette had a much broader vision. From the outset, he saw NDEs as powerful catalysts for changing human nature and therefore our social, political, and economic systems. So it came down to John wanting to transform the world and the rest of us just trying to understand what NDEs are. So the initial goals for the organization were really to foster research into NDEs in a variety of ways. First, we wanted to provide support to near-death researchers. As I said, we were all working in isolation at our individual institutions, often with either an indifferent or sometimes a hostile university administration who wanted to squash this type of research. We also wanted to set standards for what near-death research should be. Again, working in isolation, we didn't know what other people were doing. So we each have different definitions of what an NDE was and how to go about studying them. Some researchers were interested in the changes of thoughts during an NDE. So they asked about things like lifetime slowing down, thoughts speeding up, having a life review. Others were interested in the religious aspects and asked about seeing a deity or entering an afterlife. Others were interested in the paranormal aspects and asked about things like out-of-body experiences. But we didn't have any standard of what you need to have an NDE. Do you need to have an out-of-body experience? Do you need to enter another realm? One of our colleagues said that anything that happens when you are close to death should be called an NDE. So to bring some consistency to the field, we started developing definitions and standards. And Ken Ring developed what he called the Weighted Core Experience Index to identify NDEs, and I developed the NDE scale. We also wanted to hold annual conferences at which we could share our research findings, our research methodology, and our plans for future research. And finally, we wanted to start to establish a scholarly near-death journal. This was Ken Ring's idea. He thought that we could start this journal where we could publish all this outrageous research and therefore get it into the mainstream. Well, I disagreed with that. I thought if we published our own journal, nobody would read it except us, and it wouldn't make it to the mainstream. I thought we'd be much better off not publishing the journal and forcing ourselves to publish in mainstream medical and psychological journals where other people could read it. I lost that argument, and we started the journal, which was first called Antibiosis, and a few years later changed to the Journal of Near-Death Studies. Now, I would argue that IANDS has now met those goals and more. I would argue that near-death research is now firmly established as a credible field of research. We still need more research. We need research into the relationship of NDEs to other spiritually transformative experiences, to personality traits, to physiological states. We need research into how to promote the positive after effects of NDEs and how to cushion some of the negative after effects. But I would say that IANDS has outgrown the need to foster that research, that near-death research is now so mature that we don't need the organization to keep promoting it for us. Am I right that IANDS has now changed attitudes of scientists towards NDEs? Well, yes and no. Max Planck said 100 years ago that science makes progress funeral by funeral. So we've got a long way to go, but there's definitely been some progress. This is a chart of the articles published in medical journals, mainstream medical journals, about near-death experiences in the 40 years since IANDS was established. And as you can see, in the first decade, there were a total of 20 articles. In the last decade, there have been a total of 90. Now, this includes just mainstream medical journals, not a lot of psychology journals, certainly not the Journal of Near-Death Studies. But I think this shows that the acceptance of the reality and importance of NDEs has continued to grow over the decades. No physician can now say, as they often did 40 years ago, that they didn't know what an NDE was. So I would argue that the field of near-death studies has matured. How can we quantify that? A group of social scientists led by Louise Betancourt have been studying the historical development of various fields of science. Contrary to the popular belief that science makes progress on the shoulders of isolated geniuses, what they found was that it was networking among colleagues that was the best predictor of future progress in a field. It didn't matter whether this was a new field or a well-established field, a small field or a large field. The single best predictor of future growth was the number of co-authors on each paper. Betancourt and his colleagues actually quantified this with a formula, which looks fine to me. I can't find anything wrong with that. But how do we apply this to near-death research? Well, it's difficult to see or to quantify how many co-authors there are on near-death papers, because we publish our journals in such a wide variety of fields, from neuroscience and psychology to religion and folklore. So I've looked at just the articles on near-death experiences in the mainstream medical literature. And if you can see, as back in the 1980s, there was an average of one author for each paper. And that didn't change very much until the last 20 years. In the last decade, there's an average of 3.5 authors per paper in the mainstream medical journals. So it appears that the number of co-authors has continued to increase over the years. And furthermore, there's been an increase over these decades in the number of co-authors from different countries. In the last few years, I have collaborated with colleagues at 5 different continents on near-death research papers. So I have no doubt that near-death research will continue to flourish well into the future. The question is, what role does IANDS have to play with this? Here again are the original goals of IANDS to foster research. Does IANDS still need to promote these original goals? Yes and no. I would argue that IANDS as an organization no longer needs to provide support to near-death researchers. There are enough of us out there, sometimes with other colleagues at our own institutions, that we can support each other for the most part. I would also say that IANDS as a group does not need to set standards for near-death research. That's been done decades ago. And there's now a lot of discussion in the medical literature and the psychological literature about improving standards, improving measurements of near-death experiences. So I don't think that's something that IANDS needs to keep doing. I do think we need to continue holding annual conferences. But I'm not sure that the focus needs to be on research anymore. And we'll talk more about this later. The one thing I think IANDS definitely does need to do is continue publishing the scholarly near-death journal. Even though I didn't want it at the beginning, I now have come to appreciate how important this journal is. Although lots of papers on NDEs are published in mainstream journals now, there are still some fields that no journal except ours will touch, such as the electromagnetic aftereffects of near-death experiences. So I think we definitely do need to have our own journal. So what does the future hold for both near-death research and for IANDS? My answer to that question has been obviously influenced by the trajectory of my own interests, how they've evolved over the decades. Let me tell you a story. 10 years ago, I was invited by the Dalai Lama to participate in a conference at his compound in Dharamsala, India, which was a dialogue between Buddhist monks and Western scientists on mind and matter. I presented research there on whether consciousness is produced by the brain, and I relied very heavily on the near-death research to make that point. Unlike most of the audiences to which I talk in the West, the Buddhist monks all were very familiar with near-death experiences. They'd known about them all their lives, but they were quite surprised to hear that Western scientists were now studying these phenomena. But what really struck me at this conference was some comments that the Dalai Lama himself made comparing Western science and Buddhism. He said that both are based on observation and logical deduction, and both give precedence to experience over belief in coming up with what's the truth. But he said, Western scientists seem to seek understanding of how the world works in order to change and control the natural world, to gain mastery over our environment. On the other hand, he said, Buddhists seek to understand how the world works in order to live more harmoniously with it, to coexist with nature rather than gain mastery over it in order to reduce our suffering. That distinction made me question what I do as a researcher, why I do it, and what purpose it serves. It changed my thinking when I start a project from what might this research tell us about how the world works to how might this research reduce suffering in the world. I didn't stop doing research, and I'm not suggesting that IANDS should stop promoting research. But shouldn't we be asking now of every research project we start or every one that we promote, how will this research help humanity? How will it help near-death experiencers? I think it's time now to think outside the box. Now, I know many of you have been telling me for decades to think outside the box, but I think we have to know what's inside the box before we can think outside it. And now, after 40 years, I think we have a pretty good understanding of what's in the box. And I see research now shifting from the phenomenology of NDEs and what causes them to the values and implications of near-death experiences. What do they tell us about how to live and about how to die? What do they tell us about the relationship between the mind and the brain? Is the mind simply what the brain does? And if so, how does the brain create thoughts? Well, in fact, mainstream neurophysiological explanation is the brain does create the mind, but they have absolutely no idea how that could possibly happen. So does the brain create the mind, or is it just filter our consciousness, letting in only a tiny fraction of what's out there? Some people have compared the brain to a cell phone. If I call you on your cell phone, you hear my voice coming through the phone, and it might seem as if the phone is creating my voice. Certainly, if your phone dies, you stop hearing my voice. But my voice doesn't stop. It's still out there, you just don't hear it anymore. And they argue that the brain has a similar function. Our thoughts are out there, our mind is out there, and the brain receives these thoughts and filters them and just lets in some thoughts and not others. And when the brain goes down, you stop having those thoughts, but the thoughts are still there. Does it make sense that the brain filters this input, the thoughts? Well, yes, it does, evolutionary-wise, because the brain evolved, like all our other organs, as a physical organ to help us survive in the physical world. For example, our eyes don't let in the entire electromagnetic spectrum, but just the visible spectrum. It filters out all the infrared and ultraviolet light because those things don't help us survive in the physical world. There are other reasons, other areas of research about NDEs that are still up for grabs. For example, what do NDEs tell us about surviving bodily death? Is death really an ending, or is it just a change of state? And most importantly, what about the spiritual after effects? How do we, the NDEers, and their significant others cope with these? Over the decades, I've seen IANDS expand from just promoting research to promoting research and also helping people learn from near-death experiences. IANDS efforts over the years have included more and more efforts to help individuals, certainly near-death experiencers, but also those with spiritual awakenings from other types of experiences, to those dealing with death in a variety of ways, those who were terminally ill, those who were suicidal, and those who were grieving. Perhaps my thinking about changing my viewpoint has also been influenced by writing my book, After. Once I retired from the University of Virginia, I started writing what I thought was going to be an overview of everything I'd learned about near-death experiences. But as I started to do that and started sharing it with other people, I realized that there were already several excellent books that were presenting the state of the art of near-death research. And I didn't want to just repeat what other people had already written and probably said better. What I really wanted to write about was what NDEs mean for the near-death experiencers, for science, for me, for all of us. In part, this book was my gift back to all the near-death experiencers who helped me with my research over the decades. And in part, it's my summary for other people in the general public about what NDEs have to say about life and death. Again, I'm not turning away from research, nor am I suggesting that IANDS should do so. What I'm suggesting is that the focus of the research should be shifting. And in my opinion, it should continue to shift in the future. This is a good thing. This is a good thing. Near-death research has received almost no funding from outside sources. And there's a good reason for that. It's because near-death researchers haven't answered the main question that potential funders have. Yeah, these are fascinating experiences, but so what? Why should we spend money to study them? An important consequence of shifting our focus from the phenomenology of NDEs to what we can learn from them in helping other people, either with their own unusual experiences or with coping with death anxiety, end-of-life issues, or bereavement. An important consequence is that unlike basic research into what NDEs are and how they come about, applied research into the practical lessons of NDEs are much more likely to be awarded grants from government and private funding agencies, which will ultimately increase the amount and quality of NDE research. This is an important point. Let me repeat this. An important consequence of this shift is that applied research into the practical lessons from NDEs is much more likely to receive grants from funding agencies, which will increase the amount and quality of NDE research. So if IANDS has expanded its focus from basic near-death studies, then what is its focus? IANDS already not only promotes research, but also provides services to NDEers. How has it been doing this? In addition to the original goals that IANDS had of promoting research, it also has developed over the decades additional goals. First was providing service to near-death experiencers. It's done this through starting local support groups for near-death experiencers, which now have become the Friends of IANDS. It's also changed the focus of these conferences to focus more on the NDEers' needs and less on the researchers' needs. And in recent years, for people who don't have access to a local support group, it started the IANDS sharing groups online, ISCO, thanks in large part to Chuck Swedrock. IANDS is also focused on providing service to the public, providing reliable information on NDEs. It's done this through educational pamphlets, such as our pamphlets on childhood NDEs, on distressing NDEs, on NDEs and grief or loss. We've also participated in mass media videos, such as the BBC's The Day I Died. We've also produced our own targeted educational videos. For example, for a training video for veterans and for healthcare workers about NDEs. IANDS has also been spreading the word through its YouTube channel and through NDE radio, thanks to Lee Whitting. Furthermore, we've produced educational books, among them with the English translation of the Dutch book, The Self Does Not Die, and the recent volume, Voices, which was articles from the journal Narrative Inquiries in Bioethics. And finally, IANDS has been spreading lessons of NDEs for different societal concerns. How to cope with death anxiety in the era of COVID-19. IANDS is not reducing its interest in science, but I see it more as pushing the boundaries of science. Perhaps promoting a reconciliation between science and spirituality. I've heard people arguing back and forth about whether NDEs are physiological events or spiritual events. As I see it, it's clearly both. NDE research suggests that science and spirituality are in fact two sides of the same coin. Yesterday, we heard Kathleen Pate and Julie Exline talk about 3 different lenses for looking at ADCs, after-death communications. They can be looked at through the lens of mental illness, a normal psychological process, or a supernatural process. And they illustrated with the case that you can have both the supernatural lens and the normal psychological process lens. And I would add to that the mental illness lens as well. There's no reason why you can't have an NDE that was triggered, for example, by a brain injury or a drug use that has genuine spiritual features to it and also serves some normal psychological process. Too often, people get locked into looking at just one side of something. And they don't even think to look at what's on the other side. So are NDEs physical events or are they spiritual events? Is this a duck facing left or a rabbit facing right? Both answers are correct, and neither one is correct by itself. You need both to understand the entire picture. I think both individual researchers and IANDS as an organization can play an important role in highlighting this attitude, recognizing both aspects of our world, the material and the spiritual, which ultimately reinforces the value and importance of NDEs. My interests over the decades have evolved from the extraordinary features of NDEs, such as the out-of-body experience, seeing deceased loved ones, to what NDEs suggest about this life before death. NDEs are not important, as I see it, for what they say about death. They're important about what they say about transformation, about renewal, about finding meaning and purpose in this life right now. And I've seen in the same period of time, IANDS evolving from a collective of researchers to a source of support for near-death experiencers and for significant others, and also a source of reliable information for the general public. I see the future of near-death research and of IANDS as an organization, focusing on the values and lessons of NDEs, on the spiritual growth that often follows them, the ethical transformations, the reduced fear of death, the awareness in a mindful way of the present moment, and the awareness of the interconnection between all people. As people have said before me at this conference, the COVID-19 pandemic has produced unprecedented global death anxiety with long-term psychological as well as physical after effects. If you add to that the raging wildfires we're seeing here, the severe hurricanes, the mass protests, the political polarization, there's clearly a need for a bigger perspective than we ever had before. And I think there's a role for IANDS to play in showing us a larger perspective on life and death. This is getting closer and closer to John Odet's original goal of transforming human society. But it's not quite there yet. And I still think that that goal is a bit unrealistically ambitious. But what we can do, both individually and as an organization, is to help individuals transform their attitudes towards life and death, and create a more meaningful and fulfilling life. It may have taken us, and especially me, 40 years to get to this point, the same point where John Odet started out 40 years ago. But I think we're all on a much sounder footing now that we've done the science to support this conclusion. Thank you.